the University of Pennsylvania, and the Library of Congress. Dr. Lingel has one of the coolest non-academic jobs I have ever seen on somebody's CV. She worked for a time as a digital media librarian for MTV. I had to mention that because it's very cool. Dr. Lingel's research focuses on 3 key areas: alterity and appropriation, and investigations of how information and technology is altered, tinkered with, subverted, and articulated by marginalized groups; the politics of infrastructure, where systems of categorization, organization, and design can reveal underlying ideologies and logics; and technological activism as a way of exploring how these socio-technical practices can contribute to projects of social justice. In her own activist work, Dr. Lingel concentrates on prison abolition, libraries as a vehicle for DIY education, and local access to mental health resources. Dr. Lingel's here giving a talk, and she has 2 books that have come out in the last 2 years that I think rather perfectly encapsulate her dual academic and activist pursuits. The first, An Internet for the People, The Politics and Promise of Craigslist, details how the platform's policies, like a straightforward monetization scheme and user anonymity, produce and support a particular type of public. And in this examination, Dr. Lingel shows what we stand to lose with an internet that is increasingly flashy, homogenous, and closed off. Last year, Dr. Lingel also published The Gentrification of the Internet. Pulling from her deep expertise in this area, she arms ordinary internet users and activists with the language to understand the internet as it was and as it is, so that we might imagine what it could be. Along with folks like my colleague, Dr. Daniel Kreis, and some of our fabulous students, we're also here at CITAP thinking through these questions about what platforms owe democracy and what that might look like for it to work out well together. So we are really deeply excited to have you here and hear about your work on this. After the talk, we will have a Q&A session. For those of you that are joining us online, you can submit your questions to us via email at CITAP, C-I-T-A-P, at umc.edu. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessa Lingel.
That was so kind, and thank you everybody for coming. This is my first work trip in 2 years, and like giving a talk in public without a mask, without a Zoom lens, so it's like kind of amazing. But because I'm battling the construction, I'm going to project. So thank you so much, Shannon, for inviting me, and thank you so much, Katie, and thank you for being for the introduction to CITAP, which is a group that I've just really enjoyed following and learning about. And it's so fun to be here and meet your grad students, postdocs, and faculty. So, all right. Oh shoot! I just realized that I don't have the notes. They're on my face. We're just gonna have to run a little bit. Okay. So if you, like me, have been studying digital culture for a while, you will have noticed an important shift in how we've been talking about the internet over the last decade, right? So in place of the heady techno-optimism of the late 1990s and early 2000s, things have gotten a little bit more less optimistic and more skeptical. So there's been this shift in mainstream narratives about the web generally and Silicon Valley specifically, this increased worry that technologies that have promised so much have delivered so little. So whether we're thinking about things like Brexit or the 2016 US presidential election or misinformation campaigns around COVID, this reckoning of sorts is pretty welcome in certain ways. In terms of assessing the impact of technologies that have become increasingly embedded, of course, into our everyday lives. And it's important to critique mainstream social media companies and to recognize the consequences that they bring. It's harder to come up with alternative models of online platforms that have more transparent or accountable or democratic politics. And in order to think through paradigm shifts of platform politics, and in order to do it in a very grounded way, I want to consider the socio-technical facets of an online platform that has remained incredibly stable and tried to remain ethical over the last quarter century. And I want to convince you that the best place to do that is Craigslist. So yes, Craigslist, which got online in 1995, based as an email listserv based in San Francisco, first went online as a website in 1996. Very quickly, Craigslist became very popular. In my own family and friend group, I am sort of known as a person who likes to buy and sell things on Craigslist. Can you advance it for me? I'm having trouble. So what kinds of things you might ask? How about these deck chairs? Bought those on Craigslist. What else we got there? I buy a lot of chairs on Craigslist, you'll see. I bought a ficus tree. This is not a recent picture. Mr. Ficus looks even better now. The phone that I actually took that photo. It looks like an ad or something, but that's the phone I still use. I bought that on Craigslist. Kind of a funny story. Maybe we can get into it later. I buy a lot of things on Craigslist. Did I do that? Cool. Shannon mentioned my job at MTV. People often think I have some cool story of how I got that job, like I was at a bar with Kurt Loder or something. That's not what happened. This is the email I sent to apply for that job. You'll see right here, this is a Craigslist ad, right? So, that email actually set me off on a career of being a librarian that led to me getting a PhD, that led to me having the job I have now. If I could talk to the girl who sent that email out in 2007 and tell her that she would become a professor in an Ivy League school, I would have laughed in your face while desperately wanting it to be true. So in so many ways, I owe Craigslist a lot of things. Okay, so you get it, right? Lots of people, certainly me, use Craigslist, but why does it matter? You're obsessed, Jessa. Why should the rest of us care? Well, a couple of reasons. So in internet years, Craigslist has been around a very long time, since 1995, a decade before Facebook, 3 years before Google. Basically, almost as soon as ordinary people were going online, Craigslist was there to help them do ordinary things. Craigslist is also very stable financially. It's a privately held company that's never had more than 3 shareholders. Currently, shareholders are controlled entirely by 2 people, founder Craig Newmark and CEO Jim Buckmaster. This is what Craig Newmark looks like holding a pigeon. I can also show you what Craig looks like when he is randomly joining your talk. So
if I can get the zoom onto the right window, yes.
There is a Craig of Craigslist.
Joining us briefly today.
He has many enthusiasms, including birds. He is a committed philanthropist these days, and he gives to things like bird sanctuaries, to families of veterans, to journalism, and also to voting rights and military families.
All right, we have now blacked out your screen. I don't even know how to fix it.
I can see Craig.
Great. We'll get him here. I'm fixing
For
it.
a second.
What?
Make it weird just for a second.
Yeah, first I just gotta find the mouse. But yes, I'll fix it.
And Katie's been such a rock star in figuring out all these different technological elements that we wanted to figure out. But, hi, Craig.
Welcome, Craig.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me, or have I muted myself?
No, we can hear you just great. How are you in New York or San Francisco?
San Francisco this week, although I do live in New York City. It's just that we come back here for friends and family sometime, and of course to say hi to the birds.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Well, thanks for joining the talk, and feel free to fact check me as I continue. All right, so that's Craig, who I will say was the very first person I interviewed for this book. I've never had so much writing on a single interview, and he turned out to just be this wonderful presence who's been very kind in helping me to learn more about this platform. Okay. And Craigslist has been very stable. Craig is no longer the CEO of Craigslist. He stepped down some time ago, but he is still, you know, in many ways, a huge part of its legacy. So that's part of Craigslist stability in terms of finances. We can get to Craigslist stability in terms of aesthetics. So have you ever played the Wayback Machine game, where you look at a URL from the past? Right, so my own home department, this is what it looked like in the 1990s, 1986, getting a little sexier by 2003, and then these days you have this very normal looking website. You cannot play this game with Craigslist. Here is what the website looked like in 1998. Okay, a little bit of difference in 2008. This is 2018. I defy you to make a meaningful game out of the differences, especially in those last two slides. So my argument here is that Craigslist has largely stayed the same while the internet around it has changed. And in that sense, Craigslist is like an island in the middle of this constantly shifting socio-technical ocean. So surely, the book argues, if we're interested in thinking about how the internet has changed, a productive strategy is to look at a fixed point and to consider how its policies and practices get read against the grain of changing norms. So really the questions I'm trying to answer here are, what are the norms of Craigslist that become strange when we consider today's web? And how can thinking about Craigslist norms and uses help us build a critique of socio-technical paradigms? Oh, now I need to do it again. So methodologically, what did I do here? I teach a lot of methods classes at Penn, and very passionate talking about methods. Happy to answer questions in Q&A about these. I use semi-structured interviews with ordinary Craigslist users that I found by advertising on Craigslist. Also, insiders and experts like Craig, legal experts, security experts, an FBI agent, different people with perspectives on Craigslist from an expert perspective. I did textual analysis. CEO Jim Buckmaster wouldn't talk to me, but he has penned over 300 corporate blog posts, so I read all of those. I scraped Craigslist help forum to look at things like scams. Strongly encourage you to check out YouTube series called Craigslist TV that ran for a couple of years. That is a rabbit hole worth going down. I watched every episode of that. Scraped the Reddit forum. Analyze things like what I call mashup blogs, so blogs that people create based on Craigslist ads. I did legal analysis of key court cases. If you don't know me very well, I am not a quantitative scholar, so I'm very proud that I ran a survey with 91 people, 91 Craigslist users, just to get some sense of, I don't care about external validity, but like a little external validity for some of my claims. Some of my best friends care about external validity. Okay, so those are the core premises of the book, and I want to give you a brief overview of how the book is structured, and then dig into a couple of chapters as time permits. We'll see. So I spend the first half of the book telling the Craigslist story in a couple of key ways. So it's social history based in San Francisco in the 1990s, a particular moment in the tech scene. I tell a media history of Craigslist, moving from a classified ad site to changing classified ad in newspapers to Craigslist. And then a little bit of a legal history, digging into key court cases, mostly around CDA 230 and the journey to FOSTA. So that's what Craigslist is. And then in the second half of the book, I talk about how Craigslist gets used. So in the first place, talking about buying and selling, what are people doing when they buy and sell on Craigslist? Finding work, in particular, Craigslist history with predicting and then sort of being surpassed by the gig economy. I talk about Craigslist personal ads, online dating generally, and the stigma around online dating, and then stigma around Craigslist personals, which were, of course, shut down because of FOSTA-SESTA. Happy to come back to that. And then I talk about people problems and how those emerge on Craigslist, so things like flagging and policies around anonymity. So counterintuitively, I'm going to talk about the last chapter first and then go back to talking about work. There's time, which I hope there is. So whatever you're doing on Craigslist, whether it's buying and selling, looking for a job, trying to find, you could go back in time and go on dates, Craigslist exchanges involve trust. So even brief Craigslist interactions come with expectations and norms, with implicit and explicit rules of engagement. So I divide this chapter into trust failures and then thinking about the platform responses. All right. So Craigslist, if you imagine a spectrum of problems on Craigslist with irritable annoyances on one side and like criminal activity on the other, you begin to get a sense of the range of social issues that emerge when strangers come together online. And it starts with flaking. Pretty much everybody I talked to about Craigslist, whether for the book or just in casual conversation, had frustration around flaky behavior. So whether that means long delays during email exchanges or people failing to show up at an agreed upon time. So this is where trust failures start, but it's not where they end. And one thing to notice about this trajectory I'm tracing is that complaints about flakiness assign blame to individuals rather than to the platform. So it's about reducing trust in people rather than Craigslist itself. These tend to be exasperating rather than scary. So flakiness sort of is thought of as wasting people's time, but it doesn't directly threaten their privacy or safety. When it comes to those issues, the stakes are higher and people look to platforms and to policymakers to intervene. And then there's scams. It would be difficult to overstate how much scams dominate in popular narratives about Craigslist, even though you were just as likely to get scammed on eHarmony as you are on Craigslist Personals or on LinkedIn as you are on Craigslist job ads. But nonetheless, the pinned subreddit, for example, on Craigslist is titled, "Is This a Scam?" So participants describe a number of scams that they encountered, mostly based on information phishing or check fraud. My colleague Julia Tacona is doing really great work on scams on care platforms like care.com. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to check out her work. So I'm sort of flying through these two because the one that I really want to talk about has to do with safety. So people I interviewed were annoyed by flakiness and concerned about scams, but the biggest concern they had involved their physical safety and the threat of violence during in-person Craigslist exchanges. You might expect these concerns were heightened for women who felt themselves to be a particular risk when it comes to meeting strangers in public. Now, statistically speaking, women are much more likely to be attacked in our homes and by someone we know rather than in public by a stranger. So for example, in the United States, 70% of sexual assaults committed against women are committed by people who are known to us. Nonetheless, discourses of strangers targeting women in public space are very powerful and boosted by common experiences of things like street harassment. So on the whole, women express safety concerns more often and describe taking more safety precautions than men when I was doing interviews. So when it comes to flaking, people blame each other, but when it comes to scams and safety, people look to the platform to intervene. How does Craigslist respond? They take two forms, flagging and anonymity. So when he took over as CEO in 2000, Jim Buckmaster instituted a flagging process asking users to report problematic content. So that could be because of something as simple as miscategorization or because they think it contains a scam. And when I talked to users about flagging, it was often tied to expressions of exasperation, so wanting to punish bad actors, or as a form of looking out for other people who might be viewers of the site. So we see flagging can be a form of punishment or of protection. But while the logic of using flags was clear to people I interviewed, they were usually less clear about how specifically flags worked, which you can get a sense of with this quote from Denny about a trial and error approach to figuring out how to tackle a scammy ad, and all names that I'm using to talk about participants or students. So as people like Kate Crawford and Carl Gillespie have argued, flagging may seem democratic, but it's not usually all that legible. Like most platforms, Craigslist doesn't publicize the number of posts flagged or the process that results from reporting a problematic ad. There's a lot more to say here about flagging, but again, for time constraints, I'm going to skip ahead to anonymity. Very happy to come back to flagging in the Q&A. Like the number of topics I have invited you to bring up in the Q&A are getting very long, but you can come up with your own topics. All right. So on Craigslist, users are anonymous by default. So although some people opt to include identifying information like a phone number or a home address in their ads, most don't, leaving email as the main mode of contact. So in my interviews with Craigslist users, I noticed differences in accounts about safety and anonymity when I interviewed people, and particularly women of color. While middle-class white women almost always saw Craigslist policy on anonymity as a threat to our personal safety, many of the Black women I interviewed expressed a more nuanced view, where concerns for physical safety were mitigated by an appreciation for retaining privacy. So here, Molly is a middle-class, middle-aged white woman, and Shayla is a young Black woman. And I don't have the kind of data where I can make representative claims about white women feel this and Black women feel this. I can only say that I noticed these patterns in my data as I was doing interviews. I also want to note that when I interviewed white women, they would invite me into their homes, a person they were meeting off of the internet. So every single Black woman I interviewed met me at a public place, like a Burger King or a library, and they always brought friends along. And so I surfaced that to talk about the ways white women talk about privacy and safety, and then the actual people people who are taking steps to protect their privacy and safety. Why don't those things match up? As Lina Sucha has noted, quoting here, white women's claim to a protected interiority receives the widest cultural stage, insofar as white women are required to embody interiority for others. So in interviews, white women most often express claims to a protected interiority, which emerged as fear, frustration, and anger around anonymity, often described in feminist language. So complex negotiations of patriarchy and racism come into play here. I want to be clear, women are justified in being afraid of being in public. They are justified in taking steps to protect their privacy. But at the same time, women's relationship to danger or perceptions of danger and risk in public are inflected in complicated ways by race and class. Let's talk about this dude. So these complexities that I'm trying to surface tend to drop out of mainstream narratives around anonymity. So this is Matthew Brian Brown, a self-described experienced social media expert and digital marketer. As an online personality, to me, he embodies the millennial hipster. As an aging hipster myself, I feel like I can make these claims. In terms of his interests, which are like beards and zombies and the internet, and his rhetorical style adopting a tone of continual irony and skepticism. So he wrote a review of a platform called Garage Sale, which I want to walk us through, because when he compares Garage Sale to Craigslist, he taps into themes of violence and fear and anonymity and community, making up some of the core hopes and fears about the internet. So anonymity is the default on Craigslist, as opposed to Garage Sale, which has many mechanisms of visibility. So you have to first have an account on Facebook, and then if I'm opening up my account on Facebook, Garage Sale then has access to my profile and network. Garage Sale also has community leaders who moderate content, and they're supposed to be a first line of defense in heading off user disputes, which, as a side note, is just a way of the platform pushing labor onto volunteers. So Garage Sale ads frequently emphasize safety without explicitly mentioning Craigslist, but others make the comparison pretty clear. So for example, that YouTuber, Matthew Brian Brown, describes Garage Sale as a community because everything is linked to Facebook. It feels very personable. First time I heard about Garage Sale, I was in Canada. I saw an ad for Garage Sale. I was writing this book and I was like, Garage Sale, it's meant to be Craigslist for women, right? It was very clearly targeted that way in its ad. So buying into the normalization of self-disclosure and cross-platform linking, Garage Sale basically outsources its identity verification process to Facebook. So as the company explains in one of their help pages, the reason Garage Sale uses Facebook is so other members can see that you are a real person with the possibility of having common friends. This makes transactions more comfortable and creates the feeling of community within the Garage Sale groups, helping to make it less anonymous. There are so many social norms packed into this brief explanation. Facebook not only guarantees that someone online is real, which we know is not true, it also makes my social network visible with the potential of seeing or making friends. Do I want that? Requiring self-disclosure supports a sense of comfort and community, according to Garage Sale. But of course, we should ask, recalling these differences in interviews with women of color and white women about anonymity, we should ask, for whom is this self-disclosure comfortable? Whose communities see themselves reflected in Garage Sale's definition of safety? So for groups who are marginalized in some way, the visibility of a Facebook profile can be a source of harm rather than safety. So in this trajectory I'm tracing, tech companies have a vested interest in normalizing identity authentication and self-disclosure, supported by not unreasonable fears of fraud and deception. So taken together, these narratives conflate anonymity with a problematic behavior and link verification processes like bootstrapping to Facebook as demonstrating trustworthy user behavior. The intersections of identity in the internet are far more complex than the black and white binary of anonymity bad, visibility good. So in her influential text from 1998, side note, I have like a passion project of like surfacing books from the internet from like the 1990s that told us everything that was going to happen. So in Annette Markham's book, she had these metaphors of using the web, which she characterized alternately internet as place, internet as tool, internet as way of being. So we can map Markham's framework onto different mechanisms of anonymity that can clarify some of these tensions around privacy, anonymity, visibility, and safety. So when it comes to online marketplaces, Craigslist sees itself as a tool of privacy, while Barrage Sale sees anonymity as a threatening way of being online. So as a tool, anonymity can be used to provide security or protect against discrimination. Craigslist anonymity policy instead is intended to protect privacy and prevent harassment, partly because Craigslist ads are meant to be fleeting and ephemeral. Barrage Sale's emphasis on connecting users within a local neighborhood has a temporal dimension, with neighbors as persistent relationships that develop over time, and also a moral dimension of middle-class prudence and thrift that are absent or at least not pronounced on Craigslist. Barrage Sale delegitimizes anonymity, the rough one, as a way of being online, holding up visibility as a safer, and I would note, more suburban way of being. So part of the confusion around anonymity stems from failing to separate when is it meant to be a tool of privacy versus when is it meant to describe a harmful way of being online. I am very ambitiously going to try and get into Craigslist and work. And the reason I want to do this is I want to take you on a little bit of journey from how one book led into the next, but I'll try and be mindful of time because I really do want to leave time for questions and answers. So you might not know this, but Craigslist's roots as a website actually started so in San Francisco's tech scene. They were publicizing events related to the tech scene, and they were publicizing jobs. There was actually a moment when Craigslist was known as the go-to source for tech jobs, full stop. There was a moment where if you were interested in tech, you wanted to move to San Francisco, like so many people, and create a job in the tech scene, you would go onto Craigslist. That would be your first, sometimes your only stop for how to find a job in the tech scene. So this is a quote from Christina Murphy, who was a headhunting expert in the tech sector in the 1990s and was also one of 4 people loosely gathered under Craigslist's original management team. And here she's highlighting this moment when Craigslist launched as an incredible resource for people trying to hire in tech, but also is much cheaper than posting ads in any other employment magazine. So over time, Craigslist has started charging small fees for various kinds of ads, but job ads have always required a fee, with the logic that anyone who could afford an employee could afford a small fee for an ad. So the pricing structure has changed a little bit over time, but charging for job ads on Craigslist is one thread that they've always held on to as part of their business model. So initially, as I'm saying, people saw Craigslist as having the inside scoop on tech jobs, but over time, Craigslist jobs were less about working in the tech sector and more about the kind of working arrangement associated with disruptive innovation, meaning gig work. So these are jobs you can currently find in the gig section here in Raleigh-Durham. Maybe you want to help set up an alpaca booth. I know I do, but those are the kinds of jobs that are on the Craigslist gig section here. So one thing that became interesting to me as I was talking to people about finding work on Craigslist was what I saw as a paradox. Because in many ways, Craigslist was a forerunner of the gig economy. It predates words like micro-work and gig economy. But these were also exactly the kind of jobs that today lead people to think of Craigslist as skewed towards blue-collar and working-class jobs. The idea that Craigslist was part of the poor people's internet was a theme that I heard again and again in interviews. And I became interested in this because thinking about class politics shed light on many features and functions of Craigslist, but emerges most saliently around work. There are thousands of full-time, highly skilled and professional jobs with benefits. That's how I got my MTV job advertised on Craigslist every day. But like most people I spoke with, Kathy here describes the stigma around using Craigslist to find work. She implies that Craigslist might be used by wealthy people, but they'd be reluctant to admit using the platform, and she had learned to keep her use of the site private to avoid skepticism and, as she called, smears. So as Craigslist expanded beyond San Francisco into other cities, and the internet became available to more and more people, the exclusivity that had defined Craigslist in its early days eroded. Gig work with its diverse labor pool, low wages, and operational interchangeability represents the inverse of where Craigslist started in the world of online HR. One thing that was interesting in interviews is that people use the same number to describe Craigslist as either an incredible opportunity or as part of the poor people's internet. So for example, Jillian is an upper class woman, middle-aged. She says, I feel like Craigslist has never had a good reputation. It's always just been a little shady. Even the jobs are shady, right? It's like $20 an hour. You can compare that to Shelly, a young woman and a working mother who said, I got paid $20 an hour through Lyft. She found a Lyft job on Craigslist. So no matter how you slice it, whatever time of day I work, if I work 5 hours straight, I'll make $100. That's lit. That's paying my bills. That's getting my gas go on Monday. You know what I'm saying? It pays my half of the rent. So for her, $20 an hour represented the upper echelon of jobs that she could expect to work. And Craigslist was an important vehicle to finding jobs that she felt were literally lit and paying her half of the rent. So basically what I'm saying is sometimes when people think Craigslist is sort of is like scammy or problematic, it says more about them than it does about Craigslist. So Craigslist's working class reputation points us to shifting norms and priorities between Web 1.0 and 2.0 politics. I am not here to talk about Web 3.0. Not ready. Craigslist platform politics emphasize access, dating back to an earlier vision of the internet where access was supposed to ensure that anyone with an internet connection could learn something new or find new opportunities. But in the brainstorming from this participant, Rob, of what might be driving Craigslist's lower class stigma, he suggests that instead of a positive form of inclusion, accessibility has a negative connotation as a lack of exclusivity. So Craigslist doesn't use profiles, so users can't display markers of social status. On the employer side, ads are ranked by date. There's no option for boosting visibility other than just reposting your ad multiple times, meaning that all ads are basically equal. In a social media landscape driven by likes, visible social networks, healthy displays of consumer status, Craigslist can feel too much like an unfiltered free-for-all. I got this image today of what happens when you try and autocomplete why it's Craigslist. So what I'm arguing here is that one way of thinking about Craigslist's reputation is as an unintended outcome of its commitment to accessibility. And to understand that, we have to go back to the socio-technical norms of the 1990s. So openness and access drove a lot of Web 1.0 rhetoric. In the early days, internet access required expensive tools and equipment and expertise. Over time, the internet became cheaper and more accessible. Schools started teaching digital literacy, social media sites integrated content publication tools, meaning people no longer had to learn things like coding or markup in order to get their content online. Whereas in the 1990s, getting online took technical skills. In the 2000s, it became easier to get online, but harder to know who to trust or who to pay attention to. And Craigslist's reputation illustrates these trade-offs in access and status. The meaning of access has changed from openness as a positive form of inclusion to openness as a negative lack of safety. Put another way, in the 1990s, elitism required technical skill, but on the contemporary web, elitism means a display of status or the ability to pay for promoted content. And this flipping of accessibility from positive to problematic signals a shift in platform values, away from democratic norms of equal access to more corporate norms of self-promotion. For Craigslist, the lack of vetting systems and promoted content has contributed to its reputation as a source for working class people, a far cry from its origins in elite tech work. So it's at this point in my analysis that I realized, that Craigslist class politics were pointing me to a larger problem in digital culture, which I started thinking of as the gentrification of the internet. I'm gonna kind of skip this because I'm happy to come back to it and I want to leave more time for questions, but I just wanted to signal that this is where I started thinking about the gentrification of the internet, was I was trying to describe metaphors of the internet. So we have Dana Boyd writing about the internet as white flight. I have some of these late 90s texts where people think of the internet as colonizing, although that metaphor has certainly come back. And I'm trying to offer gentrification as another metaphor for thinking about these shifts in platform culture. So if Craigslist is indeed part of the poor people's internet, should it change? In a way, the question is moot because the company's leadership seems very committed to it being as it is. But we should also pause at the idea that a site that works for the working class needs to change. So writing about the transformation from MySpace to Facebook, Dana Boyd noted, the idea that working class individuals should adopt middle class norms is fundamentally a middle class notion. So perhaps it's a similarly middle-class assumption that Craigslist class politics are a problem. In an increasingly gentrified internet, Craigslist may become even more important for its accessibility and holdout politics. So it might seem like I'm setting up Craigslist as this like knight meant to save us from evil corporate profiteers, or maybe I'm nostalgic for a simpler, purer internet. I get that critique a lot. And the fact that Craigslist has kept its look and feel and core features intact for almost 3 decades makes it a useful object of study in terms of the internet and digital culture, but it doesn't make it perfect. So I disagree with certain ways that Craigslist has handled requests to use its data, and they've struggled to overcome a reputation for fraud and crime through this notion that they can sort of doggedly work with law enforcement behind the scenes and expect the broader public to care. Although I argue that there are democratic values in maintaining a simple design, I do not want the entire internet to look like Craigslist. But what I do want is to ask what it means to have a site like Craigslist endure on the web for so long, and to think about how its politics and user practices can help us understand important changes in online politics. And I will leave it there, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. I'm going to monitor our email too. And just as a reminder to those watching, if you have questions, you can email us at CITAP, CITAP at unc.edu. No. Okay.
Yeah, I just think this is really great. This is more of a comment, I guess, because I'm not sure how to frame it as a question, but I just think it's interesting how the model of like a Craigslist space is sort of repurposed in private spaces. So I'm part of this group on Facebook called Little Brown Diary, which is a network of 30,000 South Asian women across North America. And so the more I see sort of what you're talking about, it's been replicated in that very niche space of like there's Little Brown Diary buy and sell, and then Little Brown Diary jobs. And so I guess what does it mean for this model that is viewed as sort of fraudulent or has all these negative connotations to be repurposed in all of these niche spaces?
Yeah, I mean, there's like an early slide of like all the things that Craigslist like competes with. So like, oh, maybe I don't even have it, and I'm just going to stand through this for no reason. I'll just leave it here. There's like a thing of like, there's an amazing diagram of like, if you want to compete with Craigslist, like here's all the things, like Airbnb and Verbo for this, and like eBay for this, and all these job sites over here, and all these dating sites over here. And it's kind of amazing that there was a time in the internet where like one platform would be comfortable doing all of those things, rather than this like intense specialization of like, farmersonly.com, like dating just for farmers, or like, okay, like there's stuff like, there's sites where you can buy and sell that's like just for your mid-century modern furniture. And so I think that on the one hand, that kind of like specialization reflects a determination to separate oneself, like you kind of think of like academics in the same way. But on the other hand, I think if we go back to early message boards, like some of those were also very focused on a particular thing. Like we only talk about Deep Space Nine here. We do not talk about the other Star Treks, just Deep Space Nine. So like there are these other ways where specialization has fallen in and out of favor. But I am very curious to see how the constraints of the broader platforms like Facebook shake out, even if people are trying to build these communities that are more in line with like an earlier ethos. So those are some of the tensions.
Yes, very interesting presentation. I'm curious about what the rest of the internet can learn from Craigslist. Right? So specialization, I think, is one topic, or maybe generalism, the opposite of specialization. But as you say, perhaps the rather austere aesthetic of the site is maybe not a thing to take from this. But I'm curious about, in the abstract, what are maybe 2 or 3 things that the rest of the internet can really learn from Craigslist?
So one thing that Craigslist has really experimented over time with different moderation strategies. You can agree or disagree with where they've landed, but there was literally a time they were working so hard to try and have personal ads in a way that wouldn't fall this poor Boston stuff. They wanted personal ads where people could engage in sex work if they wanted to, or just find romantic work, or find like BDSM stuff. Like, and the lines there get pretty blurry as you're trying to run up against different content moderation rules. There was a minute there where Craigslist was actually paying lawyers to look at different ads that had been flagged and determine whether or not they fell foul of content moderation rules. Can you scale that? Probably not, but it was a willingness to bring in expertise and paid labor, and a willingness to experiment that was proactive instead of reactive, that I really, really admire. And the other thing that I would maybe call out, I really believe that other platforms could make their monetization strategies more transparent. I'm not a fan of like everything needs to be transparent and then all the problems will be solved. But when Craigslist users don't understand how the platform makes money, it's because they've never been charged for the small number of ads that you post. So if I'm a car dealer and I'm selling a car, I pay a fee. If I'm an individual person selling a car, I do not. When some Facebook user doesn't understand how the platform makes money, it's because Facebook wants it that way. Facebook wants the user to be as transparent as possible to the platform, and the platform to be as opaque as possible to the user. And I genuinely don't understand why Facebook, I mean, I do, but like, I do think Facebook could do a lot more to make its users' relationship to the profits that they make more transparent. And that would be the other takeaway that I would offer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. And I feel like I could that would be for hours. And also, like, I have a million questions, but so I'll just ask one. So I'm old enough to remember, because I started my master's degree in 2003, when Craigslist was seen as destroying democracy, especially through the taking away of classified ads for journalists. That narrative was a bit overblown, but I'm wondering, given that you went back in time in history, like what other sorts of democratic concerns were being aired back in the time when Craigslist was getting started, building the past 90s and 2000s? Do they mirror certain things from today? And like what might not be there? So like it's striking to me, I'm looking at like discussion forums, for instance, yet I don't ever remember mis and disinformation being part of the narrative of Craigslist from that era. So I'm just wondering if you could like help historicize it through the lens of like democratic.
So it's funny, I had never thought of Craigslist as a classified ad all my years using it. It just never occurred to me until I started digging into the history. And it has since changed, but there was a time when if you looked at Craigslist on LinkedIn, it just said Craigslist is a classified ad site 5 times. That was the company description. Like, we are a classified ad site, end of story, right? So they clearly have always thought of themselves in this way. I would say the narrative that first surfaced, it's important to remember Craigslist was huge in explaining to people what the internet was. So in the 1990s, there was like a genuine confusion among the populace, like, what are you supposed to do here? And there was actually a moment, I'll get the year wrong, where more searches were being done on Craigslist every day than on Google. There was a time when more people were just running random searches on Craigslist than they were on an actual search engine, which is like kind of mind blowing. And so the early press around Craigslist often focused on the personal ads and often focused on like the internet is surfacing information about people's quirky dating habits. And so there was like this fascination with the things people wanted to do on Craigslist and were willing to post in an open and honest way, that I think comes in waves and has usually come about youth. The one thing that was different about Craigslist is that it was about adults. You know, there wasn't as much of a narrative on like how are the young people going to be corrupted by this platform, so much as like I had no idea how much cake was going on in Queens. You know, like so that is in some ways predictive of other overblown narratives about the internet, but in some ways was very, very different. And the other thing that I would say that Craigslist was unique in is because it had the same format no matter what city you're in, and yet the content that was posted to Craigslist could be this opening into local geography in a way that I don't think you can say is true of other platforms. So you could really get a sense of what it was like to live in Texas by reading the Misconnections ads in Austin. You could really get a sense of what it was like to try and find a roommate in Salt Lake City in a way that just by reading the ads. And I don't think you can kind of have that kind of hyper localization in a voyeuristic way on other platforms. So one thing that I encountered during interviews, especially people who use personal ads before they were shut down, is this sense of I used to just kill time reading these ads at work. That's how I would do it. If I would just like look at who's posting Misconnection. Misconnections, by the way, are when strangers post something saying, people are nodding, but if you don't know, you'd be like, I saw this hot girl at Whole Foods. We were like, you were wearing a red baseball cap, and I was buying pomegranates, and we should fall in love. And they weren't really meant to be requited. It was just like a documentation of strange encounters. And this is so not related to your topic, but I want to say Ingrid Burrington did this like map of loneliness in New York, where she geo-plotted Misconnections ads in New York to see where they happen. And they follow subway routes a lot, but the loneliest place in New York is the Whole Foods in Union Square. That's where the most Misconnections are. So my grocery store example was actually very in keeping with what she found. So I would love to expand on that more, but this is my fast answer.
Thanks, I really enjoyed this. I had a question about the perception you found that Craigslist is shady or even unsafe. So I was trying to think about what would explain this perception and why it's widespread. And I mean, it's not obvious it's just because Craigslist is unsafe. So maybe that's one explanation. But alternative explanation could be that just Web 1.0 was unsafe. Or I thought maybe an alternative explanation was that big Web 2.0 players tried to convince us that these older platforms were actually unsafe. So do you have a sense of where the perception comes from?
I do. So in 2009, two important things happened. So Craigslist was winning all kinds of awards for like being like a tech innovator, for being like the best place for community online. And things really changed in 2009 for two key reasons. One has to do with the so-called Craigslist killer, a med student in Boston who was accused of killing two women and attacking a third, who were sex workers that he had found on Craigslist. Very high-profile case, alleged because Philip Markoff then took his own life in prison before the case was determined. So there was that high-profile case, and at the same time, Sheriff Dart in Chicago in Cook County launched a campaign with attorneys general across the country, insisting that Craigslist was responsible for human trafficking and trafficking. We had a very high-profile public campaign connecting Craigslist to sex work. I want to say that researchers have found that when you shut down a platform like Craigslist or Backpages, violence against sex workers actually goes up because women then and men who do sex work then have less control over the clients that they meet, and they have to rely on pimps rather than themselves to vet clients, and relying on pimps can be a great way to increase your risk of being assaulted. So I trace all this back to the difference between how white women who are not as much of a risk for being attacked in public talk about safety, and then when you actually talk to women, one of the most dangerous professions out there is sex work. When you talk to sex workers about whether or not Craigslist should be anonymous, they will tell you over and over again it should absolutely be anonymous. So 2009 was a key year, but I very much think there was a vested interest in the tech industry in insisting that you are unsafe unless you give us your data so that we can protect you. I will also say, though, that if you are used to a Web 2.0 internet and you use a Web 1.0 internet, you have been conditioned to think of safety to think of anonymity as a harmful way of being, and you have not been conditioned to imagine safety as a potential tool for privacy. So there's a lot I'm willing to blame tech companies on, but I do recognize there's like a genuine element to people feeling one way or another. So I don't want to like disparage that. I try to be very careful when I talk about this. Be like, women should do whatever people should do whatever they need to do to feel safe, especially women in public. but there are these overtones that I think are really important. So hopefully that answered at least part of your question.
No, thank you.
For fun. I think we can talk. But two questions. One, I'd love to know more about your flags of what you found about flagging. All the work I do on Wikipedia and flagging and like YICAC and flagging, super relevant. I want to know more. And then I spotted the difference, and I want to know more about when like gig as a separate category of job arrived and like the socio-technical implications of that. Was it like someone at Craigslist noticing this increase in work, or like how did that and when did that?
That's it. I don't have a good answer for that. I really don't. All I can say is that categories come and go based on different cities. So there's like Craigslist has like 50 employees. It's never had more employees than that. And so stuff like rises to the surface. Newmark actually worked after he stepped down as CEO. He actually worked in customer service for a long time. He like had a boss in his own company that he would like report to. So he worked in customer service. So like concerns would get surfaced in customer service that could then be addressed through new categories, but I don't have a good answer for when it first got started. The stuff on flagging that I find really interesting. So in Denny's quote, he would talk about, there are a lot of folk theories about how flagging works, and when a platform doesn't reveal how something works, it will always lead to folk theories about how something works. And so Denny was like a regular Craigslist user. He would look for jobs in all sorts of different cities on Craigslist that he could do remotely. And so he thought of himself as like an expert on Craigslist. He thought of himself as someone who was looking out for other people. And so he really saw flagging as like a step that he would take to protect people who weren't as savvy. And so he had all these theories about like, I've noticed if I flag it from my device, then it doesn't get taken down right away. So I always flag if I'm really upset about something, I will log it to multiple devices and then flag it on all those devices so that it gets taken down faster. So that's like a lot of caretaking work of total strangers that he was willing to take on top of his other work. So that was one thing that I found. Another thing that I found that was in that same vein of protectiveness goes back to sex workers who would use flagging to post they would flag ads of John's that they thought, I know who that guy is, and you don't want to go on a date with him, so I'm going to flag it. So I'm going to protect other sex workers. And that's actually a different thing than Michelle White wrote a book on eBay, and she closes out that book with a chapter on Craigslist where she has a very different take. It is true that women in particular posting ads of like personal ads, not necessarily sex work, just like, this is what I want. Like I am particularly like women of color who would talk about their desires. Those ads would get flagged by white dudes. You can't prove who did it. But like the idea was that women of color in particular were having their ads flagged, and that's not what women want, right? And it is, in my experience with men, it is very likely that men would imagine that that's not believable, women wouldn't want that. So she raises the idea that flagging could be problematic for sort of narrowing the kinds of relationships that you can have. But I think it's important to note there are other people who found it an important form of protection. So those are some of the themes that came up.
Volunteer flagging.
Yeah, exactly.
It's such a bizarre process to me.
Yeah, I mean, just the amount, it takes so much work to find work on Craigslist that you would then sort of be like, nah, someone's gonna fall for that, and I've got to do I'm gonna log into multiple devices to make sure that someone's not getting suckered. I mean, that's like for strangers. You have no idea who else is looking at that ad, you know? So the idea that you could surface community with such thin information about other users is like, that's something worth thinking about. Yes.
So first echoing everyone's thanks on your presentation. My question is maybe a bit more predictive on your part, but how sustainable do you think Craigslist is, especially with Web 2.0 norms and keeping this, we talked about being a prominent here in people's perceptions of Craigslist, but also with the more siloed models of Facebook Marketplace, having an individual platform for individual categories. So how sustainable do you think the long run Craigslist would be? Thank you.
Craig's still on.
Craig unfortunately had to drop off just about 5 minutes.
Very curious. So that's fine. I'll tell you. So So Craig and Jim are in lockstep about what Craigslist should look like, and they have complete control over this corporation. So Craigslist still gets more monthly page visits than ESPN.com or New York Times. So there's an image that it is not still a popular platform, but it is. Over time, it has dropped further and further down in the rankings, and it will continue to do so. I don't think their model is sustainable for forever. But one thing that so Craig, and they would be forced to change their business model if it were a publicly traded company, but it is privately held. And Craig and Jim are in lockstep about this platform. And so the platform, my prediction is the platform will continue to look and feel exactly as it does until one or both of them are just no longer at all involved in the company, or they sell their shares, which is incredibly unlikely. And then someone will come and try and buy it after they are no longer able to run the company, and they will change it, and then the platform will die forever. So I don't think, I will say though, I was surprised when I started trying to recruit Craigslist users. I really assumed everybody would be my age or older. I was stunned by the number of 20-year-olds who are using this platform every day. And it's part of their arsenal. Like they use Craigslist to find certain kinds of jobs, Indeed to find other kinds of jobs, Fiverr to find other kinds of jobs. So I think it will continue to be relevant for some time. I don't think it will in the end be able to compete with these other platforms. I think if it gets to show it, I don't think, but one thing that I love about thinking about Craigslist, I have a quote from Jillian who said, there's no historical preservation side of the internet that says this thing mattered just because it existed and was, important for its time. And so that's the way that I think Craigslist will be most important, is it will no longer be as important for what it does, but it'll be more important for what it represents. But I do think it will at some point just not be able to compete with these other platforms. Yes.
Thank you also for everybody is saying. I have two questions. And so one of them is, when I think about Craigslist is like the buying and selling, right? Of like work, that you pointed out. But then I'm also noting that I didn't realize that there were discussion forums on Craigslist and like the community pages. And I think what I'm really interested in is because like I haven't seen Craigslist be used even as like this infrastructure for people who are doing organizing or activism, right? Like there's often a turn to the kind of more like major for-profit platform, other ones that we see. And I would love just to kind of hear your thoughts on these other uses of Craigslist and what we might like learn, right, about these concerns around privacy, trust, how that gets negotiated around like speech, expression, et cetera, that I think are also topics of concern on these like other platform spaces. Is one question. And then the second one kind of builds off of I think the flagging question. And I really appreciated what you said about like the ways that racial and class norms get transposed onto like ways that platforms get governed. And so like, we'd love just to kind of hear like your thoughts on the ways that some of these race and class norms like have potentially right the trust kind of schemes on other platforms, and what we might learn from how Craigslist is doing things, like especially around that realm, especially since I think you're talking to use another. I think there's a very personal content moderation in response to kind of like these perceptions of crime and vice and risk and safety in these spaces, right? Safety for whom. And so kind of like how you're seeing, like, are there other modes, right, of moderation that doesn't always lead to a personal solution?
Okay, I need you to repeat one or both of those. But so on the on this last thing, I think Craigslist, when I analyzed, so I scraped the help forum for every mention of like scams, fraud, tricks, like whatever. And when I did that, I got like thousands of responses. So with a research assistant, Jonathan Hayes, we sort of coded a representative sample. And we found that by far, and this actually taps into something that Shannon was talking about with work that she's doing right now. We saw people diverge in like who was to blame. Are other users to blame? Is the platform to blame, or is law enforcement to blame? And the people that, and when it comes to people to blame, it's like it's your fault for getting scammed versus it's the scammer's fault for scamming you. And those were pretty evenly dispersed. And Charles and Leslie's book doesn't often get described that way, but that's kind of where he lands in custodians of the internet, is that ultimately this problem will not get solved unless people are willing to take on more responsibility and do that work. And that is kind of how Craigslist users who are sort of like anonymous anonymously complaining about scams, also talk about it. Like, this is a problem that the platform should solve. One thing that's interesting about Craigslist though is like, because it looks how it looks, people have fewer expectations of it. People are just like, you can't expect the white pages to protect you from scams. And so there is an argument there that these platforms that invest so much in looking so sexy do then create an expectation from the users that like, well, if you can create all these really cool technological features, then you are also responsible for creating these other moderation and responses. The other thing that I'll say is it was interesting to me how few people thought that law enforcement should have anything to do with it. And that was by far the smallest number of people, you know, arguing for that. I did have one interviewee, Shelly, the woman who was like $20 an hour. Those are the rad jobs. And she was like, "Oh, when I see a scammy ad, I report it to the government." And I was like, I let it go because I was like, what a weird thing to say. And then I came back to it later, and she literally meant she reports stuff to the Consumer Protection Bureau. She literally reports ads to the bureau when she sees something that, and she was like, my mom has always told me you have to look out for other people, and you know it's scam when you see it. So she like reports ads to other people. So there are people on Craigslist known as this like, you know, free for all, nobody gives a shit about each other, it's totally scammy, and yet people are looking out for each other in a way that I think defies its reputation. What was the first question?
It was about like the uses of the discussion forums in the community, which is an aspect of Craigslist I did not.
Yeah.
It doesn't enter my imagination of Craigslist often.
There are two things that I did not talk about in the book like at all, and one is real estate, and the other is about the community pages, which are pretty kooky. I poked around. They're just like they're all over the place now. They're not archived on the Internet Archive, so it's very hard to find out more what they were like, although I could have done interviews that were targeted to do that. I think what I would say is I wanted to write a chapter about uses of Craigslist as a form of political protest. So I was finding these like anecdotal cases of like someone going through a checkpoint in the West Bank and writing a Craigslist personal ad for the Israeli checkpoint girl, and like wishing like all the questions that the checkpoint girl asked. So it was like a misconnection for like the Israeli checkpoint girl. So it was like political protest matched onto a Craigslist personal ad. There are other like satirical ads. There's a congressperson in California who was like writing a job ad for like a functioning Senate that you like wrote on Craigslist. So I really wanted to track these different moments of political protest used for the ad because like, who is it for? But I couldn't find a reasonable method for gathering those moments. So that chapter sort of fell by the wayside. The other chapter that never got written was about Craigslist and art. There are these really cool art projects that are used, that use Craigslist like location to like talk about the things that are in your neighborhood based on Craigslist real estate ads. But that was also, it just didn't get written. Book was 8,000 words, you know. Maybe it's not. I have no idea how many words. Yeah.
Hey, sorry if this sounds naive because I've been on Craigslist for 10 years. I had to sell food salt. So I had a question. What's the smallest city that Craigslist goes to? And also just thinking about the disenchantment of the recent internet, what does Craigslist tell us about the lack of access to many other things by poor rural or working class rural?
Yeah. So I don't know the answer to the thing about the smallest city. I can say a little bit that like Craigslist is largely US based. It has a competitor in Canada called Kijiji. At eBay, there's a whole drama between Craigslist and eBay that I would love to talk about, but if we need to use outside the US, it is largely by and for expats. So those are some of the things I know about the geographical constraints, but I genuinely don't know where the smallest city is. My guess is Alaska because it probably has like a whole state under the one city. So your other question was about class politics and Craigslist and what we can learn for the internet now.
Yes, I was really fascinated by the class, how you brought class into this. I was wondering whether the rural-urban divide sort of informed your analysis, and also just that there's something to be that there's a lesson here for the increasing rural divide and lack of access to internet and other problems that are.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about thinking about about internet access in terms of broadband. And I think that that's the thing that COVID has really shown us. So people are like, oh, all these people with smartphones, nothing like broadband access. And so that's a real urban-rural divide. Craigslist has its own urban-rural divide because it just functions better in large cities. It just does because there's a critical mass of people in a small place geographically. So I made a point when I was traveling more of always looking at Craigslist in particular cities, and it does change. My personal favorite is if you go to Brisbane, Australia, and try and use Craigslist, and if you try and go, there's a scam that they do. It's not really a scam. Drug dealers will post Craigslist ads. They will post it for things like, would you like to buy this stroller for your kid? And then when you click on the ad, there's an image of like the different drugs that they sell at the JPEG, right? So all of the information is written onto the picture. So for some reason, they really enjoy putting these in like ads for stuff for children. So I've never seen that scam. Not scam, it's just like a way of selling an illicit drug. I've never seen that except in Brisbane. So there are these weird novelties that take hold where Craigslist has a legitimate claim on being illegitimate because it's where people sell drugs using baby ads, right? So there's this whole other dimension of like class politics with Craigslist that has more legs to it than I was giving shrift to in my work. I think that this is something that I've been thinking about extensively and writing about countercultural communities in my first book, which is like the way that tech companies just get left behind because they can't make users feel like they belong to a fancier internet based on how they appear. So when you're using a dating site like OkCupid, you think that it is for you because it's like young and hip. And when you get on some of these niche dating sites that look more like Craigslist and they look like eHarmony, it is sending you a message about your value and how much you belong and how much you belong on the wider internet. So there are these very coded ways that users of these platforms on the sort of fringes of the internet, so what counts as fringes, censored, says a lot about you, that are reflected in the design in an important way. And so I think the thing I've been trying to argue since my first book is like, what we really want to pause in these moments of like, we have to update to remain the same, as Wendy Chun argues, that like these constant updates are something that users are begging for. I don't think all users are begging for those things, but there's an important thing that happens where when they fall in love with or find a lot of utility in these platforms that look outdated, that should be enough on its own. And yet when these other platforms surface around it that become so advanced, or technologically slick, people on these platforms who were completely content now suddenly feel like they are not. And that came through so strongly in my interviews, and that's where I started thinking about gentrification. Same thing. If you were living in a gentrified neighborhood and you live in a house and your family has been content there for decades, and then these apartments go up that make your house look shittier, even though it looked fine before, when these businesses come up that you can no longer afford, you feel out of place even though your life hasn't changed, your house hasn't changed. The businesses where you want to go to, that's still a genuine interest. Things around you shape your own sense of your own value within this community. That was not as articulate as it could have been, but hopefully it answers at least part of your question. Yes.
So, in relation to that, I wonder if you might characterize, and for lack of a better word, like who is the corporate user of Craigslist over time? Because I'm really old, and I remember Craigslist in the 90s. I actually lived in the inner sunset right down the block from the Craigslist office. And like I'm especially thinking of like the jobs and housing, because like back in the day, they were the good jobs, and also they weren't posted by HR or recruiters. Like they were actually like the person who was going to be looking at it. And that changed, right? And same with the housing, right? It used to be like the landlord who posted it, and then it became like the complex, or then the. And so, but there are still individuals on Craigslist that are just so like change over time that relate to the gentrification aspect.
One thing that's great about Craigslist is if you're searching, for example, for furniture or for cars, you can click on by owner versus by dealer. So you can say, when I'm looking for furniture on Craigslist, I don't want to deal with dealers. I only want to deal with the other people who are selling their mid-century furniture, right? So that ability though to click on one versus another and filter, like I only want to see posts from humans versus I want to see posts from people like corporations. That's actually kind of cool. Like that is a feature that would be useful in more parts of the internet. I would say, you know, what Craigslist has, there is part of me that wishes they had written more about real estate in Craigslist because it did carve out a niche for a long time of like, all that other stuff has gone to shit, but the real estate ads are still what's really useful. And when I used to do these, when I first started giving a talk about Craigslist, I would ask people at the beginning, like how many people have used it for what and what. No one ever wanted to say that they'd used it for personal ads, but a lot of people would say, me too, that they had used it for finding property, right? And so there was like this way in which that was like a safe way to use Craigslist. That was like a practical way to use Craigslist as opposed to the other parts of the site, which has become more risky. So as much as I'm talking about Craigslist as a holdout of the ungentrified internet, there are parts of Craigslist itself that people would feel are more gentrified than others, or more acceptable, or less risky, or more more middle class and less class. But I just didn't talk about the real estate part. I like wanted to interview realtors and stuff, but it's been up for 10 years. I really had to like wrap that. I've thought about that. It would be a different book if I hadn't been on the clock. Like it would have been I would have been able to take more time with it. And that's a question we should be asking ourselves about this system, that if you're a book person, forces you to stop these books where you want to. I mean, it's cool. I got 10 years.
We probably have time for one more question before we wrap today. If there's anyone with one on deck.
Something I was curious about was how you brought up how you were surprised that Craigslist had a younger user base than you thought. And I think when like we're thinking about children using the internet, like the main concerns are anonymity and like lack of content moderation. So do you think there's any cases where like Craigslist needs to do more to have some sort of age limit verification for that?
No, I gotta say, I don't think it really needs it. I don't think the young kids are like, this is where I'm gonna spend my time. I think I talked to a tech journalist called Justin Peters, and I was trying to ask him, like, why do you think young people are still using Craigslist? And he said it was because of nostalgia, like children of the 90s going to 1950s themed diners, like nostalgic for something they never experienced themselves. So like Craigslist is a portal to like Web 1.0 internet for people like Gen Zers, you know, like what was that internet that they're talking about? But it's like still alive. And like, the savviness of some of these young folks who are using it really blew me away. I was like kind of afraid for this young woman who was like saying that she was using Craigslist for modeling work, and I was like, modeling work or modeling work? And she was like, no, like here's all the strategies I use to make sure that these ads are legitimate. Here's all the precautions I take. And so I was like excited that like young people using a platform that they haven't been conditioned to use and haven't been conditioned to evaluate whether or not something is safe. And I think it really is generational. One thing that I've been thinking about is like, we always talk about the scams that are perpetrated on the elderly because they like, oh, I'm from Amazon and your account's been locked and you need to do whatever. And like a person like my mom being like, that sounds legitimate. But there's check scams that young people fall for because they've never written a check. That like older people who use the internet are like, that is not how checks work. And they're like, younger people are like, I've never written a check. I've literally ATM seen old school. Like, where is your Venmo? Or like, I guess this is how the olds use money, and then they are more susceptible to it. So there's like a whole generational narrative of scams that we're not telling because we just believe these, you know, all we hear are these narratives of old people being scammed, and we don't hear these narratives of young people wouldn't be scammed if they had more access to older people who are like, don't send that check back, it is a bad.
right, well, please join me again in thanking. We have a couple more speakers left in our spring series. You can see them all on our website or follow our Substack. So thank you all so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much for coming and all your questions.
Okay.